Okay. Time to look sharp.
Am I in your way here?
No, you're fine.
Okay.
Welcome back, everybody. Thank you for joining us again for the second half now of the 2022 Hudson Valley History Reading Festival. It is my pleasure to introduce our next set of speakers. We had double speakers the last two sessions, so it's kind of fun. Russell Dunn and Barbara Delaney are former New York State licensed hiking guides, which sounds like a really cool job, and co-authors of many books, including Paths to the Past, History Hikes Through the Hudson River Valley, Trails with Tales, History Hikes Through the Capital Region, and Adirondack Trails with Tales, History Hikes Through the Adirondack Park and Lake George, Lake Champlain, and Mohawk Valley regions. Russell himself has written 11 regional waterfall guidebooks, 5 regional paddling guidebooks, 6 hiking guidebooks to amazing boulders and rock formations, 10 regional photo books of stereographic images, a guide to the Great Sacandaga Lake, and a guide to Ausable Chasm. Wow. Barbara is the author of Finding Griffin, an Adirondack novel, and Follansbee Pond Secrets. She has contributed articles to Mohawk Valley Heritage and Adirondack Sports and Fitness. Please welcome our speakers. Thanks.
Thank you, Cliff, for inviting us today, and thank you, audience, for being here. We are today going to talk, about Paths to the Past, a book of historic hikes in the Hudson River Valley. Now, our book has 31 hikes, and we're only going to talk about 4 of them. And we'll be talking about Slab Sides, John Burroughs Sanctuary, Geralamo Park, Valkill, Eleanor Roosevelt's place, and
Snow
Hole in the Taconic Range. So, we can do it. Okay.
I got it.
All right, I'll do it here. So as you can see, Paths to the Past takes you to 31 beautiful places of historical interest. Part 1 is the Hudson River Valley and Catskill region. Part 2, the Capital region. Part 3, Saratoga region. Part 4, Taconic and Berkshire regions. So this is a cover shot of it. This, the cover is, it comes out really nice up there. It's based on it's a painting by Thomas Cole, and it's a view of 2 lakes that our former speakers talked about up at North Lake and the Mountain House. So we'll start with Slab Sides, the John Burroughs Sanctuary. Now, Slab Sides is on the west side of the Hudson River. And I'd say it's pretty much right across the river from here. John Burroughs was a very popular author in his day, and he wrote about nature. He was really one of the foremost writers about nature at that time. And it was a period of, I think, paying attention to the landscape in the late 1800s. John Muir, who was also another naturalist, was there at that time. And of course, you had Walt Whitman writing about nature. So John Burroughs wrote many essays and many books about nature. And he built, which I thought was very interesting, he built a slab sides in on the other side of the Hudson River. And he built it himself with his son, Julian. When Julian was maybe 17 and John Burroughs was in his 50s. What's remarkable about this place is that it's hand-built slabs of bark on the outside of it. It's just a simple cottage. And the picture here shows him in that cottage. And amazingly, the cottage is still there at the nature sanctuary. He based many of his observations about nature from his surroundings there. I think he wrote Keep a Sharp Eye, which is a book about birds while he was there. He also lived, had a home in West Bank, Riversby, but it was only about two miles away, and that was pretty much right on the river. This shows an exterior, and this is a contemporary picture. It looks like this today. They only open the cottage once a year, so you don't get to go in and, look around, except that once if you happen to catch it. And here's a picture of the interior of Slab Sides. By the way, the sanctuary is about 200 acres, beautiful trails, lots of rocky outcrops. There's a pond on the trail. It's a very nice place to walk around. Now, he invited many of the famous people of his day, or they sought him out. They would come to Slab Sides to visit. And one of them was John Muir, the famous naturalist who kind of was instrumental in having Yosemite made a national park. At any rate, John Muir came to Manhattan, took a train up here to Hyde Park, and John Burroughs and his son Julian rode across the river, picked them up at the train station, rode back to West Park, and Muir stayed overnight. And they both were big fans of Ralph Waldo Emerson, so they had a lot of chatting about that. And then I guess they rode back, but he stayed overnight, took a hike around the property, saw the beautiful waterfall. Now, many people visited Slab Sides. It was a very kind of a destination for other nature lovers and famous people. Walt Whitman, as I said, came there. He was a very close friend of John Burroughs. Theodore Roosevelt, Theodore Dreiser, Henry Ford, Edward Harriman, who led a famed expedition to Alaska at that time. And they made Burroughs the official historian. And I know when reading about it, Burroughs says the porters, he had his own, whatever you'd call it, sleeping car. Everyone had their own who came on that expedition. They got to Alaska, they were on boats, but he comments that the porters were better dressed than he was. And it was a very, very swanky group, I guess. And now we're looking at some of the property. There's a rock called Julian's Rock. It's up on a hill above, a rocky slab above where the Slab Sides house is. And you can walk up there, but the stairs are very kind of rocky and uneven. If you've been there, you realize that it's not safe to scamper down for sure. Scampering up might work. Here's a picture of the pond on the property and all the rocks surrounding it. There's a shelter cave. And this is located behind the cabin. Really, the trails are especially beautiful. I think anyone would enjoy walking on this property. And I like this saying. It happens to be put on a tree there, where he says, 3 most precious resources of life, if he could say, would be books, friends, and nature, and the most constant and always at hand is nature. So that's the quote from Burroughs' writing. So now, Russell.
So you're going to see a pattern unfold. Barbara's talking more about places and people, and I'm focusing more on the hiking areas. The concept of Paths to the Past really is to have created a book that hikers can enjoy with history involved, or historians can involve while they're hiking. So it's a dual concept. So Joralemon Memorial Park is located outside of Ravenna, which is northwest of here as you're heading towards Albany. And it's a very unique park. Yes, it has its normal functions, such as a pavilion, a ball court, tennis courts. From my standpoint, what makes it interesting is the other side of this road that bisects the park. And we start off with Joralemon Cave. This is part of a pre-glacial master cave system. So this thing predates the last glaciation that our previous speaker was referring to, this Wisconsin glaciation. It's large enough that you can enter it, and you can go in maybe 20 feet or so. It's about maybe 3 or 4 feet high, so you can't stand erect in the cave, but you can certainly duck walk in there or couch. When we first went into the cave, a whole section was cordoned off, and it gave us the impression that there was some kind of archaeological dig going on. In the winter, it's fascinating. You go in there and you see stalactites on the ceiling, and you see stalagmites, which are the lower ones that are formed, not so much from the secretion of limestone, but rather from water seeping through the ceiling of the cave. Geologically, this is a fairly dead cave. But there's another part of it, and it's a little ways behind in the woods. You come to the Joralemon backdoor cave. Yes, you can go in this if you want to crawl, but you can't go very far, and it doesn't connect to the master cave, Joralemon Cave. But obviously at one time it did. My suspicion is when the glaciers came through, the weight, thousands of feet of ice just kind of pressed down and certainly did damage to some of the caves that were in the area. I've written a few books on boulders, so I'm always interested in boulders. Our previous speaker was talking about glacial erratics. What you have in Joralemon Memorial Park aren't so much glacial erratics, but rather these big chunks of rock that are broken off from a ridge line. And they're laying all about. And they're pretty good size. In fact, some of these, if you have kids, you bring the kids there, they can play around in these things. It's like a fortress. And you can see from this particular slide that these aren't rounded rocks, the kind that would be rounded if they're being moved by glaciers and transported. These are rocks that are basically of the locality that you see them in. Now, there's more to it. Amazingly, there's a pre-Civil War kiln. And it's being held up by a tree that initially destroyed it. But as you can see in the image, the tree is actually holding it together still. And when that tree goes down, I suspect the whole thing is just going to collapse into rubble. It's fascinating to see something like this. It's totally unexpected. On the other hand, the region that we live in, which is Albany, and then there's Schoharie and Lower Albany, where Ravenna is located, there's a lot of limestone. And it was quarried, and blocks of limestone were used for the Erie Canal, for building the Brooklyn Bridge and other places, cathedrals. In this particular case, my suspicion is that the kiln probably was turning limestone into quicklime, and it was used as a fertilizer. Now, another shot of the kiln. There's an interesting place called Hanacroy Swamp. It looks real spooky. And you can thank the beavers for this, actually. They have dammed up the outlet stream. And there's a lifeless quality to it, kind of a spooky, eerie quality, only made habitable for the beavers. Excuse me. And I mentioned about the beavers. They've created this swamp, and the outlet stream, as you will see, goes down through this rock opening. What they've dammed up is a cave system. It's called the Hanacroy Maze Cave. Spelunkers, or as they like to call themselves, cavers, really, have explored this area. Initially, 2 caves were discovered, the Sleeping Alligator Cave and something called the Choice Cave. They discovered 2 other smaller caves, and then eventually they realized that there was a huge cave system there, a maze, a labyrinth, that it went over an area about 200 feet by 200 feet and containing about 2,000 feet of passageway. Now, before you think twice about going to see this cave and entering it, it's a crawl. And you probably want a wetsuit on because it's going to be very wet, and maybe you might not enjoy fighting off suckers and these kind of creatures that inhabit the caves, bloodsuckers. It's not the friendliest environment to be in. There's another cave there, and I don't have a real good picture of it, but it's called Merritt's Cave. I believe it's a continuation of the Hanacroy maze, but the 2 aren't physically connected in any way that a caver can go between the sections. An interesting rock just outside of Joralemon Memorial Park is Joralemon Rock. If you look at it, you'll see that it actually looks like it's attached to the ground, and indeed it is. This is one way of knowing it's not a glacial boulder. This thing exists because everything around it was eroded away, leaving this standing there. It's about 15 feet high and probably about 15 to 20 feet long, and there's an overhang there that goes about 10 feet, and so you can actually go underneath it and crouch. And my suspicion is that in the past, Native Americans, I'm sure, used this as a shelter as they were going from one region to another. There are paths in here and you can follow them, but boy, everything has changed a lot since we've been going to Joralemon Memorial Park. There's now a disc golf course in there, and you can see people in there with their Frisbee-like things, discs, and they've turned it into a fun park. But from a geological standpoint, it's a fascinating place to go to.
So we'll next talk about Valkill. Now, Valkill is the former home of Eleanor Roosevelt, and she stayed there during Franklin Roosevelt's presidency sometimes, and when later years after Franklin Roosevelt died, it was her primary home. It's a National Historic Site. It's right in this neighborhood. I can't tell you how to get there exactly from here, but it's within, 5 miles, I guess, up here. It's the only National Historic Site dedicated to a First Lady. Jimmy Carter signed the bill creating the site in 1977. It's a very, very interesting place to visit. The Stone Cottage, there's a good story about how that came about. Eleanor, Franklin, and 2 of Eleanor's friends, Marion Dickerson and, I forget her name now, Nancy Cook, were having, thank you, I appreciate it, they were having a picnic on the Valkill stream. And Eleanor was musing, wouldn't it be nice to have a little cottage here as a getaway? Because otherwise, the only cottage that, and it wasn't exactly a cottage, was Sarah Delano Roosevelt's house, Springwood, was only open in the summer, but it was a huge mansion. And Eleanor, so Franklin took up the idea, he loved the idea, and he also actually enjoyed doing some house designing, architectural work. So he and his friend or worker, Henry Toombs, designed this cottage. And it was going to be primarily for Eleanor and the two friends who were there at the picnic with her. And it was opened in 1925. And for a while, the two partners, Marion and Nan Cook, they lived in it primarily. And when Eleanor could get free, she came and lived there. They were very close friends. They were very active in the Women's Democratic Association. They were very interested in some craft work, and it was decided the next year that they would expand and create Valkill Industries. And that house is still on the property. I'm going to see if well, this is the stone cottage still. They opened it in 1926. Oops. And I've told you already about this part. And this is Eleanor and her friends. And again, this is pictures of the cottage. I'm hoping I have one of Valkill Industries. I think I do. Yeah, here we are. So the following year, that was 1926, they thought they would want to expand and create Valkill Industries. And that was basically to make reproduction colonial furniture. And their idea was that maybe some farmers in the area would like to learn these crafts, or immigrants. And it was pretty successful. At one point, 20 people or so were employed at Valkill Industries. And Eleanor took on the marketing aspect and would sometimes have showings of the furniture at her apartment, which was in Greenwich Village in New York City. And so that was how that was handled. And it's all of these buildings are, by the way, they do still exist. I've never been in Valkill Industries, but when I don't know whether they're open this year, they weren't open last year, you usually can go visit Stone Cottage. Top Cottage was built some point later, and it was built specifically for Franklin Roosevelt. Henry Toombs, the same architect that had helped build Stone Cottage, helped design this. And the idea was that, and it was also built to accommodate Franklin's disabilities, so that, faucets and things that he had to get to were where you could reach it from a wheelchair. And he hoped he would get to retire at Top Cottage, but unfortunately history intervened, so he never did get to do that. There's a good story about, mostly it would be happening in Top Cottage. At one point it's called the Picnic, I guess. Franklin and Eleanor hosted a picnic at Top Cottage and invited for King George and his daughter Elizabeth being the current Queen of England. And it was her idea to have a casual picnic, baked beans and potato salad and that kind of thing. Well, they served, I think it was ham and chicken, and they also served hot dogs. And according to the history books, that the king had never had hot dogs. And when he left, he said it was the most memorable picnic he'd ever been to, and he had never had hot dogs. Whether he ever had them again, we don't know. So, and here are the trails. Now, besides when you walk in the property, you can see Stone Cottage and Valkill Industries, and Top Cottage is up a trail. But there are nice trails on the property. They're I would say altogether probably under 4 miles of trails, I think. but they're pleasant walks in the woods. And here are pictures, some of scenes from the trails. So this is, one that's, I think, going up to, there's one's called Eleanor's Loop, and that's about a mile. Very scenic, pretty. I hear you see someone nodding, evidently has been on that trail. So now we will move on to Russell and Hopkins Forest.
So I'm going to talk about the hike to Snow Hole, and I'll explain what Snow Hole is in a few minutes. The hike follows the Taconic Crest Trail, which is 35 miles long, and it goes along the Taconic Crest region. And it starts at Petersburg Pass, which, if you can visualize, goes over this huge mountain ridge that straddles New York State and Massachusetts. On one side is Petersburg, on the other side is Williamstown. And Williams College factors in because it was a professor from Williams College who first wrote about the snow hole. But anyhow, you start at this high point, and if you happen to drive into this area, you'll see that it's a very big area, and you would wonder why the parking area is so large. And that's because there was a ski center there at one time that was erected in 1962 and then lasted through a couple of owners until 1980. All traces of that are gone, including a restaurant that was there and, all the mechanisms for the ski tow and whatnot. But it makes it easy to do this hike because you're going to follow along this Taconic Crest Trail, and though it undulates a bit, you never have to go down very far or come up very high. So it's a very easy trail to take, which is actually an old road, like a woods road. And you're starting at an elevation of about 2,100 feet. So you've already got a lot of the mileage in terms of elevation behind you. Not so for the students coming up from Williams College. If they follow one of the trails that comes up to the Taconic Crest, they've got to gain at least 1,000 feet in altitude. Well, the first thing you got to do, of course, is to get the gang together, and some people like to hang out in trees. But after you assemble everybody, you start the hike, and right at the beginning, there's some tremendous views looking down into the valley below. The views really are looking towards the west, towards Petersburg, and way off in the distance that you can't see is Albany, and it's blocked by the Helderbergs. Just a shot along the trail. Well, you come in a little while to the side trail, and you think, Shepherd's Well Trail, could there be a well there? Well, naturally, we were curious, and you don't have to go very far on this trail, maybe several hundred feet, and you come to Shepherd's Well. There was a farm here. We looked around and bushwhacked, and we could never find any ruins. So whatever was there just completely vanished. But this well was there. We found it, and somebody had put a tree limb over it. I guess they were afraid that somebody might just fall into it by mistake, hiking in the dark and break a leg. What does it look like today? Well, things have changed. Now there's a path, a little spur path going off of this trail that goes down like within 50 feet to the well, and there's no covering over it. It's quite visible now. It's laid bare. It's not a particularly noteworthy thing other than just a point of interest. It's about 1.5 feet in diameter, and we took a stick and we probed it, and it went down about 4 feet. So we're back on the main trail. Following along, you can see in the distance a road, which is Route 2, is heading down to Petersburg. And eventually it crosses over the Helderbergs down into Troy. Wonderful views from the top. At places what are called white rocks. Well, these are areas of exposed bedrock, and where there are terrific views, and what you're sitting on is basically quartz. And you will see, not as it looks in this picture, but way off in the distance is the Peace Pagoda, and you'll see the gleaming tower of it looking west. And we're fortunate to have this because there's only 3 peace pagodas in the United States. One is in Grafton, one is in Massachusetts, and the third is in Tennessee. After about 3 miles, that's about how long this hike is, going along a very easy trail with terrific views occasionally, you come to the sign that says Snow Hole. Well, what Snow Hole is basically a place where the earth is just pulled apart, creating a chasm of sorts. I had mentioned in the beginning, it was first described by Professor Dewey from Williams College. He said it was about 30 feet deep, about 30 feet in length, and that's about correct. It goes into the hill kind of at a slant, as you can see. It's not a vertical drop down, but rather it's more of a gradual entry. So if you don't have to be particularly daring, you can actually enter this snow hole and go down to the bottom, which many people do. And the reason why it's called Snow Hole is that during the winter, a lot of snow and ice gathers down there. And then when the weather gets warmer, it lingers into the summer. So if you're hiking along and you're sweating profusely, instead of reaching a lake where you could cool down, here's the ice cave here, the snow cave, and you could go down into it and cool off. Just a neat place. The various shots just give you a sense of it. And if you were to follow the trail around and continue past it, you'll see that this split in the earth continues along a line for quite a distance. But that's basically a surface feature. It's not anything that's enterable. The only part of this line where you can actually enter and go down deep, about 30 feet, is the beginning, the snow hole. That's a shot looking up from it. People down in there kind of exploring. They're not quite at the bottom yet, but they're on their way down. If you look, you can see that it's a pretty gradual slope going down, so it's not that hard a hike to get into. You could even go there in the winter, but it's not quite as nice because you can't enjoy the cooling effect. You're already getting that on outside of the cave. So we end with Trails with Tales. Our first book was Trails with Tales. Our second book was Adirondack Trails with Tales. One time we were doing a presentation and somebody thought we were talking about trails that dogs can be taken onto because they thought it was Tails when they heard us saying it. When we were doing book signings, sometimes people would say, well, the second book, isn't that a new edition? A second edition of the first book? We had to say, no, these are 2 separate books. So for the third book, which is the one we've talked about today, we made a point to talk about paths to the past. We went with a different title. We weren't going to use Trails with Tales again. And we thank you so much for your attention. And if you have any questions, we'd be glad to take them.
Any questions, folks? All right. Well, how about one last round of applause for our speakers?
Thank you. Thank you much.
And they will be out front in the lobby outside the New Deal store signing copies of their books, and we'll take a break till the top of the hour.
All right.